Now that we've come almost to the end of the course, it's a great time for reflection about what comes next after a course like this. Each one of you chose to take this course for your own personal reasons, and for some of you, that was a general curiosity about a phenomenon that you've observed in your personal and your professional life, probably. That is, the effects of gender, that you wanted to know more about this. As I've read the forum discussions, certain issues and questions kept emerging in your comments, so I thought I'd try to capture them here and speak to them a bit. Not to the degree that probably any of us need or want, but nevertheless, to introduce some ideas that you can start thinking more deeply about. This won't wrap the course up in a neat bow. Instead, I'm hoping that this discussion, as well as the discussion on the forum, as you identify and discuss readings that are important to you around issues of gender, will support action toward change in both small and large ways. Every action becomes a part of the change we all hope for. So whatever we are able to do in contributing to this kind of work is important. The questions are, what is the role of feminism? And in relation to that, also, what's the role of patriarchy? What changes are necessary? How do we make change? And where can we look for support and continue learning? So let's have a look at these questions a little more closely. The first question was around the role of feminism. And as we learned in Module 1, there's a history of women in leadership that's very important, but not well known. The first wave of feminism, which lasted for almost a century, from the mid-1800s until the Second World War, focused primarily on women's issues, particularly the right to vote, and there were some property issues as well that were a part of this discussion. That is, the focus was on women's political power rather than inequities in the workplace and that sort of thing. And they were looking for a solution from the state to help them become more participatory citizens in a democracy. Following the Second World War, pardon me, I've got a cold and I'm going to keep coughing probably. So I'll have a little sip of tea. Following the Second World War, there was a reassertion of male privilege, which, combined with the suburbanization of urban areas, left a lot of women who had gone off to work during the war, during the Second World War to support the war effort, or actually served in the war, in hospitals and in various kinds of duties, were being asked to stay at home in a kind of June Cleaver sort of existence. So if you've watched the old series Leave It to Beaver, you know what I mean. The woman who stays at home, dresses in pretty shirtwaist dresses, is always prepared for company coming, because her house is always immaculate, serves dinner, a beautiful dinner every night. When her husband comes home, takes his briefcase and puts it away, takes his coat and hangs it up, and he just sits down and she takes over. So that kind of existence, many women found very unsatisfying, and were keenly aware of the ways in which their dreams and desires were at the mercy of a male-dominated world in business, politics, general commerce, and so on. And those women who did go to work, and there were especially single women who had to earn a living, couldn't get much past the stenographer's pool in business, banks, and political organizations. And there were many teachers during this time as well who were married, who worked during the year on the farm as well as when they were teaching, and then would take the summer, work all summer on the farm. So these women were a part of the second wave. By the 60s, they were speaking out. And by the 70s, the second wave of feminism was in full bloom. In education, this was an exciting time in which women's teacher organizations, such as the Federation of Women Teachers Association of Ontario, which was the largest federation or teachers organization in Canada, and certainly the richest as well, because there were so many women who were teaching. They fought for equal pay, for curriculum change that broke down sex stereotypes, and they were beginning to ask serious questions about why there were so few women in principals and superintendents' offices. What was the rationale for that? And developing workshops and so on to encourage women to take up these positions. It was an exciting time, and progress was made in all of these areas, but broader notions of human rights began to emerge because their efforts during the second wave were primarily focused on cisgender white women who were moving into the workforce or wished to work and, you know, take care of their home as well. As Canada became a more racially diverse country and LGBTQ plus citizens lobbied for equal rights, Indigenous women were lobbying for equal rights, and greater awareness in all educational organizations, the work of feminism in education expanded to be inclusive of all human rights as they intersected with gender. So we can see the work of feminism shifting in all social contexts, including education. So while at one time it was a social movement whose basic goal was equality between men and women, as Lorber suggests here in her initial definition, over time its meaning was expanded. So we could say instead it was a social movement whose basic goal is equality between all gendered persons, and we could add all racialized persons and so on, as those issues intersect with gender. As a part of understanding feminism, we need to understand patriarchy, and this has come up a couple of times in the forum, and so I thought I'd just address it very quickly. And it like feminism, is a subject that requires a lot more attention than I'm able to give it here, but just to kind of discuss some of the major ideas. Literally, the word patriarchy means the rule of the father, and this goes to a kind of traditional notion of patriarchy as a system of society or government in which the father, or the eldest male, is head of the family, rules the roost, so to speak, and descent is traced through the male line. A few years ago, I was at a conference in Leeds, and one of the women that I met at that conference invited me because I was going to York next, and in our conversation, she found that out, and she lived in York. And so she asked me, you know, would I want to come for a visit and some dinner one evening, and I could meet her husband, who was also a professor, and we could have a, you know, extend our conversation. So I said, sure. And so we did meet. And because of our mutual interest around issues of feminism and women in education and so on, she brought out the deed for their small home. And it was, you know, kind of one of those typical row houses that you see in the UK with the small yard out front and the little fence around it. And a very charming place. They'd done a lot of renovations, which I enjoyed having a look at. And she said, you've got to see this. So she pulled out the deed. And because of the age of the place, the deed was a large document that was everything from the time it had been built. And it had been built, like, I think in the 1700s, maybe, something like that. Anyway, and some of the original sections of the deed were actually done in, what's it called? You know, the art form with the colored letters and so on. Illuminated. It was illuminated. And as we read through, it was really interesting because the deed demonstrated the rule of the father, very much so, because the property was passed on to the male heir. So the father owned the property and then had the right only to pass it on, or had the right to pass it on then to the son of the family. And if there was no son, as we traced through, you could see that the daughter's husband then took possession of that property. So you could watch this patriarchal lineage through the whole document until the laws changed in England, not that long ago, actually, and the ways in which property was passed along generationally, but also according to the rules of patriarchy. Of course, notions of patriarchy have changed, and in fact, they've expanded because they've expanded beyond the family. And of course, the family dynamics are a little more fluid now than one might consider a strict patriarchal notion of how things are done. But they have expanded into the public sphere, into boardrooms and into classrooms and so on. And so it's now more generally defined as a system of society or government in which men hold the power and women are largely excluded from it. So you can see this in, you know, look at pictures of just about any parliament. Now that's slowly beginning to change. We have some fairly rare examples of differences in more matriarchal notions of well, they're not matriarchal, but there's more women involved in some governments. But most governments are heavily male dominated. And in many of the committees and so on, women are largely excluded from decision making. That's beginning to change in some countries. In other countries, of course, it's not. So that model still exists in a strict or less or more fluid sort of way in most countries. We see this around boardrooms and table and boardrooms and so on as well. Higgins wrote an article that you can read in one of the long reads in The Guardian, and I've left the URL here because I think it's well worth a read if you're interested in this notion of patriarchy and how it plays out. And she argues that it's a societal structure of male supremacy that operates at the expense of women in both the public and private sphere. And that sounds so harsh. And it sounds like, gosh, we're just saying men are all mean, and the men I know aren't all mean. And of course they're not. But the system that they're a part of, that we're a part of, that I'm a part of, doesn't question. And so we just slide into our roles in this organization of this systemic organization of society. And as a result, things don't change to the degree that they might if we had a greater awareness of how power is being organized around male authority. The interesting thing is that this can be harmful. It can be a privilege for men, but it can also be a privilege for women who are willing to work within this organization of society. But it can also be harmful to both men and women. And we saw that, for example, in the last module, Module 4, where men and boys are forced kind of to be a part of this system that they may not be totally comfortable with. And so, we need to understand that this is something not outside ourselves. It's very much perpetuated by us, but it's perpetuated because we don't see it. It's kind of the invisible hand, and we don't then resist it. Okay, so let's get on. What changes are necessary? If we're going to change these systems that we've been talking about, how can we do that? Well, first of all, we can do that by considering that this is actually a layered process. And we may start, at the group level because we begin to see things that we hadn't been aware of before. We may look at the systemic issues that are involved in gender and how gender plays out. Or we may start doing internal work at the individual level. Whichever level we start at, it's always seemed to me to be a process that's layered, and that these layers are intertwined and often bear revisiting as our understanding becomes greater. So I'm not going to take time to go into this in greater depth, but I'm going to refer to resources that might be helpful in the process, and I'll leave a list of them in the box along with this video. So at the individual level, we're first asked to see gender, and this came up in the first module when there was discussion around the importance of actually seeing it. And in seeing it, then you can't ignore it. Then you've got to do something about it. You build awareness, and you do it through courses, you do it through reading, you do it through observation, and so on. You understand that it's personal, but as your understanding grows, you realize that it's global as well. Individual change is a continuing process that brings changes to our interactions with various groups that are a part of our lives. As educators, one of the most important groups we interact with almost every day is our class and students in other school spaces, for example, out in the yard at recess and so on. Or it could be other workplaces we might be engaged in, or social groups that we interact with. How can we bring gender fair practices to each of these spaces? Each of the attached articles provides some ideas, and I will include these resources, as I said, so be sure to watch for them. They're all worth having a look at. The video, No More Boys and Girls, Can Our Kids Go Gender Free, responds, I think, almost exactly to some of the comments that have been made in the forum around, is this possible? Do we even want to do this? You know, of course, we're gendered beings. So it isn't that we want to eliminate gender, but that we want to be free in our expression of gender. So when they say no more boys or girls, of course, they're not meaning that literally, but thinking about it in a more philosophical way. One critique I would offer about this video is that the producers, pardon me, the producers don't deal with gender as a spectrum, but rather as a binary. But they do that because they're causing students and others to pay attention to the way those gender norms are put forward, and then they critique them. So what it does in doing that is offers the students a way to be more fluid in terms of how they interact with their notions of gender, how they understand them, how they enact them, and so on. It's you know, in the end, they get there. I would strongly recommend that you watch both of the videos, and when you open this one, you'll see the link to the next one underneath it on YouTube. So I didn't put both of them down because it's a lot of URLs to have a look at, but I would really recommend that you read it, that you watch both of them, because you get right to the end of the process that they're engaged in, and it's so interesting. And as a teacher, watching this is just fascinating. As a parent, watching this, it's really fascinating. Of course, as our understanding of gender expands, our viewpoint begins to expand too, to a more global one in which we consider how gender plays out within various cultures and how what we see here in Canada is reflected worldwide to a greater and lesser degree. So change is a process that's expansive and yet very personal too. The process of change requires that we first identify our own biases and continue learning, which is the kind of reflection and knowledge building we talked about in the previous slide. Once we have that base, we can begin to plan and strategize. For example, you may wish to address the issue you discussed in your video assignment, where you identified an issue, learned about it, and then considered, you know, how you might want to change it. It may require some strategic conversations with a couple of colleagues in your strategizing. It may require these conversations with colleagues, maybe in this class. It could be other friends that, you know, have an interest in these issues or don't, and, you know, are kind of interested in what you've been doing. You might present a workshop at a teacher's conference and so on. Or you might feel you need to address it at all of the levels that I've mentioned. In other words, it's identifying the issue, considering the gatekeepers to raising awareness, and then planning your strategy to get them on board so that you can put this information out there. Doing so alone might be daunting. So do you have colleagues who might work on the issue with you? Is there someone at ATA who might have some ideas to support you or provide a workshop or whatever? And then be prepared for the inevitable resistance. It may feel like 3 steps forward and 2 steps back when you're doing this work, but remember, that's still progress. And as those who write about resistance remind us, resistance is an opportunity for action. Perhaps a private conversation in which you listen and respond, or it might prompt a group response in which information is provided in response to questions raised. Or it could be just, you know, responding on a social network thread or whatever. So it's important to keep in mind that support is available from your colleagues, from the ATA. There are lots of ATA resources. If you have a look at their website or even call them up and ask them about it, they've got resources in their library and so on. Your board may have policies in place, documents that are available. Ministry personnel may be helpful in locating some of this information. Or other organizations, community organizations and so on will have information. And you know, become aware of the documents that have been put forward by these various organizations that you can access, usually on the internet. Workshops, various workshops that you can either give or you can participate in, so that you can participate in them knowledgeably and add to the discussion and up the discussion level to a degree. You can look for support through in academic and popular literature, local experts that I've already mentioned, the internet. Of course, you have to consider the resources critically, but nevertheless, there's tons of stuff. On YouTube, there's tons of stuff. So there's so much that's available. And of course, there may be other ways as well that you've already identified. So there's lots more to be said, but we're going to have to end it there. So that's it. This is the last video, and so I want to leave you with this picture. What we've been talking about throughout the course is very important. It can be life-changing, in fact. I was at Butchart Gardens 2 years ago with my granddaughter, and here she is. Her name's Sequoia, and she's just graduated secondary school in Calgary. And she posed for a picture in the Japanese gardens in one of my favorite spots. Just as she did, 2 other young women came along to cross in the flagstone walk across the little waterway that goes through the gardens, and I captured this shot. It reminds me every time I see it of the importance of providing all students with a pathway over which they can navigate their gender identity despite the gender norms that try to push them one way or another into territory that's really not how they see themselves, or tells them falsehoods about who and how and what they should be. We can do better for our students and our colleagues who are caught in these same gender traps. So all the best as you finish up the course and as you move on to your classroom, whatever that's going to look like this fall, or your workplace. I hope you feel encouraged by this video, by this course, and challenged to be an advocate for change. And I know you will be that. All the best.